Good afternoon, everybody. It is Wednesday, the 11th of May. You're here at Lunch and Learn. We're going to keep everybody muted in the beginning. Leslie and I are going to do a talk on scope of practice today, as we've been advertising. And then towards the last 10 minutes or so, we'll open up the mics for questions. We're going to try and get through this all today. Please understand, we may not get through it all. There's a lot of material, even though it's a few slides. You know enough about me. Just quickly, I met Leslie, I think, back in 2010 at my very first ISNR conference, and he was working closely with running the conference. And that's when I first met him. And then I got onto the board of directors. He'd already been a president once, but got reelected, and I got to know him really well during the presidency. And we started doing this workshop together on ethics, and then he went off as president, came back on again as president, and so he and I have been working together doing these workshops now probably for I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And today we're going to focus on scope of practice. It's a hot issue, and Leslie, it's all yours.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I appreciate it, and it's always fun. Anytime Rob asks if I'm up for doing something, if he's playing along, I'm in. So always appreciate that relationship, both professionally and personally. So, and today, well, this is like a narrow subsection of ethics, and I'm sure this is one of the things that we most commonly kind of wrestle with as practitioners. At least I know that I do, and I think that several others that I've heard have. So that's kind of where we're going to like lean into this idea of just like, what are the limitations of scope? What should we do? What can we do but shouldn't be doing? And I think that's where most of us find our find the edges of what we're doing. So anyway, let's plow in. Just by way of disclosure, real quickly, important to know that, like Rob mentioned, we've known each other for a long time by now being on the advisory board of ISNR, but also on the board of directors for BCIA, and Rob also is an advisory board member for FINR, or the Foundation for Neurofeedback and Neuromodulation Research. None of those have financial implications, but worth disclosing nonetheless. So there's a couple of things, like I want to provide just a bit of a brief intro, and please feel free to jump in at any point on just like scope of practice from a definition standpoint. I think most of us have some familiarity of when we say what scope of practice is. We know what that means, but to get in a very technical sense of it might be something we don't think about every day, certainly. So what we want to try and talk about through this talk is, why is it dangerous to not understand your scope of practice, how to treat only within your scope of practice, depending on your licensure, and you don't have a scope of practice if you're not licensed. And that's okay to be not licensed. We were all one of those people at one time, and some of us, like myself, stayed in that spot for a long time. But if we're unlicensed, it's really critical that we think about what we're, quote, treating or absolutely not treating specifically, unless we're working under supervision of someone else. But that doesn't mean that we can't participate in the neurofeedback or other types of modalities. So we just have to be careful about both what we're actually doing as well as how we're describing it, what we're talking about. Want to make sure and cover how we describe ourselves. This is a thing that's really well defined in all of the professional codes of conduct, and yet this can be very misleading online if you're searching around, so we'll touch on those things. And then lastly, just a point of interest to be sure to be able to reach out to those outside of your scope of practice in order to provide that comprehensive care that we're trying to achieve while not breaching our own ethical considerations. So
what I would add to that, Leslie, simply is I would add that for those of you that may be unlicensed, you still have a risk of having anybody who's licensed step in and see that you're, depending on how you word what you do, and look to get you shut down because you're practicing a particular, discipline without a license.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and at the end, if there are people who are in that boat, like, I'll make the assumption that most people are either licensed providers or are working under supervision of a licensed provider. But if there are questions about those things, like I mentioned, I worked in sport and performance psychology as a non-licensed individual for decades. So I have a lot of awareness around how to navigate that space and both be ethical as well as reach out. So if there are those individuals of you who are in that situation, we can address that at the Q&A with any specifics. And really, this is kind of the essence of what Rob was just alluding to. This scope of practice idea is really crucial, because even though an individual may be licensed to diagnose and treat a particular condition, the modality that they are using may determine whether that's appropriate. But also, like many people in the neurofeedback, biofeedback world, they have maybe a very deep understanding and a really strong background and awareness and competency in providing that modality, but the thing that they are using it for is outside the scope of practice. And that's a really one of the most challenging pieces for us to navigate, because the public sees something online. Neurofeedback can be helpful. I'll use seizure disorder as an example. If they show up in my office as a licensed counselor and they have seizure disorder without supervision from a physician, that's outside the scope of practice, or a counselor in Arizona. So I can't offer services, even though I very well understand neurofeedback and very much understand even how neurofeedback can be applied for helping seizure disorder. So that's the example of it. It not only depends on what you're doing, the who you're doing it to, and the modality itself. So and the license. So basically, those things, when we see those things, it's easy to simply think that, oh, we can do these things because neurofeedback can be effective for that, and there's evidence. But ultimately, that's where our limitations hit. So those are the types of things that we'll kind of jump into today a bit. And really importantly, using our vocabulary matters. And this can feel a little, to be colloquial about, a little shady sometimes, because what we don't want to do is just play a semantic game. Because should we find ourselves in a situation of being brought before a licensing board, or even in a legal litigation, if let's just go back to my example of that seizure disorder client. If I say, well, I wasn't treating their seizures, I was helping them self-regulate and using neurofeedback, but they did have that seizure disorder, and I was doing protocols aimed at treating seizure disorder, it could be argued and potentially litigated and effectively litigated that I was practicing medicine by treating that seizure disorder, even though my words were not saying I'm treating that seizure disorder. So anyway, the point is, like, our words have to match our actions, but how we say and do things is a very important piece of the equation that we'll kind of talk about when we get to some of the examples.
And I think that's really important too, because a lot of us do work with seizure disorders. And I want to emphasize what you said. If you're working with a medical disorder like that, especially, make sure that the neurologist of that patient or the doctor of that patient knows you're doing neurofeedback with them, because they're your backup. They say, yep, we know that, we're approving of it, we're fine.
An easy way to do that, well, we're touching on that, is I have those individuals, those physicians, just write a letter of referral saying, I would like my patient, AB John Doe, to see you for neurofeedback with this particular disorder or this particular presenting problem, and to follow up with me in 20 visits or whatever is appropriate, so that it's very clear in the documentation that I am carrying out the orders of that individual that's been referred. But a nuance there, depending on where you are, like what state you are, that may still have some potential challenges. So if, for example, that would be working under the supervision of a licensed provider, and that might require them to be on site. It might not if you're independently licensed. So there's some nuances even in that situation that could be problematic should situations arise. So be sure and check out that what those limitations are within your state, and what documentation and how that needs to be managed before engaging. So when we think about the definition of scope of practice, just real quick, I know you can all read a dictionary, but I want to provide some context for this conversation. But we're describing the procedures, the actions and processes that any healthcare practitioner is permitted to do within their professional license, as it's defined within their professional license. And that scope of practice is limited based on generally that scope of practice is talking about what kind of education requirements are required, what type of experience or supervision hours, and then how you demonstrate competency, whether it's evaluation by a supervisor, a licensing exam, those types of things. So that's what most scope of practice definitions within the healthcare community do, or the licensing act of an individual state. So the scope of practice will be limited based on the knowledge and skills and experience, but then also what the state specifically allows you to do. And the idea, of course, is protecting the public, so that you're doing the things that the public can be assured, and the other practitioners can be assured that you have the minimum requirements for doing. So that leaves a wide open space as it regards to neurofeedback and biofeedback. There are other types of even specific interventions, as most of those are not defined within a state's practice act for a given profession, although sometimes it is. So again, not to be pedantic and read to you all these kinds of pieces, but really of an important component I've said several times, and I just want to emphasize, is that these things vary by state. So we might give you some information here that is, practical for a practitioner who's in the Carolina or in Arizona or somewhere else, but you need to make sure and look at your licensing restrictions, and that will be defined in the Practice Act, usually found on whatever licensing board's website or that Practice Act that's passed by the state.
And another piece about that one, Leslie, and I just pointed this one out to Judy, and that she put this into the training that she just did recently for mentors. There's now an issue happening within licensed, professional counselors, where there's reciprocity between 10 different states. So in other words, if I have a license here, I can treat somebody in another state. If North Carolina is one of those, and North Carolina is not, but let's say I was in South Carolina, which is one of the states that has that, and there's somebody in Texas, yeah, I can do that. But keep in mind, as Leslie said, each state may have a different way of licensing people in terms of what their scope is. So my scope here may cover one thing, and my scope in another state may not.
Exactly. And using Texas as an example, I don't think Texas is one of the 10, but they might be. I may have misread it. But Texas specifically, as a professional counselor in Texas, they actually define neurofeedback or biofeedback as one of the modalities that is within scope of practice, still limited to the types of disorders and presentations. So, but if another state, and I can't remember which one it is, there is one which specifically indicates that neuro processes like neurobiofeedback kinds of things are medical treatments, then even if there were reciprocity, you have to still abide by that particular state. So they might recognize me as a counselor in another state, but I have to follow that state's guidelines, not the one that I'm sitting in. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
And these things, all these guidelines are generally informed, and there's a lot of ambiguity, and that's why I think people get into some situation of confusion and not being particularly sure about what to do and how to do that, because it's not always easy. I was trying to find some examples to share with us today about where does it say these things in a given practice act and scope of practice. And interestingly, on all the states that I looked up, I could very easily find the minimum education and practice hours, but could not find specifics with regard to the diagnoses specifically. So they can be really tough for us to figure out. Sometimes we're well-intentioned, but just end up down a slippery slope of things because it's not well defined. As we were just saying, some of these states have a very large and well-defined language saying, hey, you can do this, you shouldn't do this, but others aren't. And I put down here, if you want to dig into that a little bit, a link to a website that is aimed at being a database, basically, of all licensing boards and professions. And you can click and filter through and see how does it compare if I'm in this state versus this state. But again, most of the emphasis is on educational minimum requirements, how many supervision hours, can you diagnose or not diagnose. In some states, depending on your profession, you may not be able to provide a diagnosis or quote treat without it coming from a referring physician. So those kinds of things are outlined in this particular database within this link, which looks like this. It's the Behavioral Health Workforce Research Center. And there they go through basically the scope of practice for various mental health care or behavioral health professions. So that can be a handy resource if you're just wanting to check out those things with regard to diagnostics and such. So now let's kind of move into providing neurofeedback. Both of our professional, all of our professional organizations. So specifically, I'm thinking about ISNR, AAPB, certification boards of the qEEG certification board, BCIA, et cetera. All of those do identify scope of practice and talk about scope of practice concerns, but they're talking about it basically pushes it off to the type of licensure that the practitioner has or doesn't have for that particular state. So for example, for BCIA, there we go, there's only 2 statements within the entire professional standards and ethical principles. That's what PSEP stands for. And it's in section B under competence. It's article 1 and 2, that BCIA professionals should operate within their local law and national law, as well as accordance with ethical principles. So it's not a license to practice independently. Everybody knows that. But then the second component of that is that professionals who treat medical or psychological conditions have to basically satisfy the licensing credential, and that BCIA does not identify or define what those things are. It is within that state. And that's the same both in the professional organizations. You might even, if you look at APA or the American Counseling Association or whatever the professional organization that dictates your practice, they also have a very similar language, which is basically saying, hey, this is what you're allowed to do by calling yourself a psychologist or a counselor or a social worker, a nurse, etc. But your state will ultimately dictate what you can and can't do. And the state often leaves it wide open, leading obviously for that confusion. So what can we do in neurofeedback? How do we move towards making sure that, one, we're keeping ourselves in compliance, but that's understanding compliance, and then also how we talk about it to others. So maybe, Rob, you want to kind of roll through some of these? You want to just keep random?
You had to unmute myself, yeah. Okay, so yeah, when you're providing services, being upfront and telling the potential clients what can be proven and what's commonly done. So what you're looking at is looking at the research. What do we know from the research and neurofeedback that we can do? There's been clinical trials or evidence of, at least multiple case studies that show that we can work with maybe a particular disorder. I have a good example is I have a colleague of a woman I hired years ago. She doesn't work with me anymore now, but she's here in the Wilmington area where I live, and she's a music therapist. And she came down with breast cancer. So I had worked with somebody who had breast cancer before, and I had did some consulting with Sarah Prinsloo. So she's a top researcher in Texas, working at the Anderson Cancer Clinics, and has published numerous articles on, looking at post-chemotherapy symptoms and treating those with neurofeedback. So there's some literature that I can say and told that first patient, and I told this current one I'm going to work with, look at that points we may be able to help with some of the side effects of chemotherapy. And this is what's commonly done. If we do a brain map, for those of you who do brain maps, and then we select protocols and we target certain symptoms in certain areas of the brain. So you want to, make sure the client knows that. Give your clients a full explanation as to what to expect, how long it may take, what the costs may be. So we've discussed this here on, webinars numerous times. The standard neurofeedback's history said 30 to 40 sessions. The more recent publication by ISNR says, 20 to 40 sessions may be sufficient for, the more common disorders. But keeping in mind, you need to let patients know if they have like a head injury or a more serious diagnosis. It may take more than 40 sessions. It could be 60 sessions. It could be more than 60 sessions. They need to be made aware of that. And then what your costs are up front. This is what a brain map costs. If we remap you, here's what a remap costs. If you do a charge for a remap, number of sessions. Some people sell packages, if you're doing home training or remote training, what the costs are. They need to know that to understand what they're stepping into, because if after 40 sessions, looking at, say, the standard, the person's not totally well, they need to have been informed that it may be longer. For those of you that have been here for a while, you know that Richard and I put together a form called patient acknowledgements, where we state these things and have the patient sign it. Have your brain maps been read by an EEG or a neurologist who has been trained in a specific area? So again, we review maps here, but if you're not comfortable with maps, you want to make sure you know that you're getting some help with interpreting a map by a skilled professional. Some people have qEEG diplomats, which means they've gone through specialized training to look at, interpreting qEEGs. So you want to make sure you've got that knowledge yourself, or someone you work with, a mentor or a colleague who can help you out. And then treating a disorder new to your practice, consider getting additional training to that specific modality. And I think that's a really important one. So many of us really come across interesting cases and go, oh, I'd like to be able to help that person. And that'd be so great, or it's a friend or a relative. I mean, how many people got into our field because they wanted to work with their kid or their spouse or a family member who had a particular disorder? But not every type of neurofeedback is easy. Now, there was a recent discussion, for those of you that are members of ISNR and on their listserv, someone was talking about side effects. They posed a question, and it was responded to by numerous people. And one of the people responding was Siegfried Othmer, who does InfraSlow training. And he was very critical of people doing it if they don't have proper training, because yes, in the absence of proper training using that particular modality, you can cause some harm. You have to be good at reading people's physical well-being signs, not just their verbal well-being signs, or looking at just their eyes. You got to be able to look at a body's reaction. So if you're in an area where you feel uncertain, then you go find somebody. I don't do training of athletes. Every time, and I did it again this morning, someone asked me about working with somebody who's like a professional athlete. I say, go talk to Leslie Sherlin, because I know Leslie has studied this, he has done it, he's worked with Olympic athletes, and that's who I refer to. And if he can take that person on, he does, and if not, he'll refer them to somebody who he can. Anything to add to that, Leslie?
No, one piece I think that's kind of, even in that nuance, like we said, like make sure and like reach out and have have the other people on board and like help out with those those professions or the things that are outside of our awareness. And also, we want to make sure that even if we're having all the right individuals involved in the care, if they're not, and I'm using my air quotes here, responsible for the care of that person, then we may still be out on an island. So if it's like, let's just say I had a client who had a head injury, a historic head injury, and now they have some symptoms that are well within scope, like some tension problems or something like that. Even though if I send it to, and I might say, I want to protect myself by having a consult with somebody who is a neurologist or whatever, and that can be, obviously additive and is helpful and recommended to do. But if it becomes determined that these are things that are resultant symptoms from the head injury, now we have a different ethical question on our hand. Am I treating symptoms that are present from the diagnosis of head injury? And if that's the case, then I'm out of scope. It's not on my scope of practice. So we have to be really really robust in how we evaluate and how we define and think about what the presentation is, even though we have the other people on our team, unless they're in a more legal way on our team of helping us, work with that individual, we may still come into some challenges.
Yeah, and a good example of that would be, again, having somebody with, say, a seizure disorder. So I worked with a patient, and as folks here know, because he's done some talks for us, and I'm sure you know too, Rusty Turner, Robert Turner, who's a neurologist who specializes in pediatric epilepsy, is somebody I can always turn to for a consult, and help with something like that. But if he's not the doctor for that patient, that becomes the problem, like Leslie's saying. You want
Exactly.
to make sure that that doctor, and I love your idea of getting the doctor just to even write up a document saying, I'm referring so-and-so to you, and please treat that person with neurofeedback and we'll, and
Mhm.
share your progress. I did that with a patient that had migraine headaches. The doctor referred, it was a pain specialist and wanted me to work with that patient. So I had that in writing, and that's, I think, a very helpful
Indeed, yeah.
and secure way of doing it. Next slide.
Great. Oh, great. There we go.
Go ahead, Ray. Go ahead.
So,
You take
well,
the
I was
slides
going to say
first.
this one's messy because it's interesting that, well, luckily, actually I should say luckily, but it's not necessarily like it's just the way it is, that most of our neurofeedback devices are registered with the FDA as biofeedback or as a biofeedback device, and then that device then can be sold to any individual actually, um, who is going to use it for education or entertainment purposes. And so learning self-regulation is certainly educational. And then if we are then licensed, we can apply that device to a diagnosis or a symptom presentation that's within our scope of practice. However, interestingly, that devices that have like 510K registration, so they're now a medical device, it's kind of a questionable thing. What happens if I have an EEG amplifier, and there is no well-established answer. There's no precedent for this in like legal way. But if I want to buy an EEG amplifier, which is 510K or FDA registered as a medical device for acquisition of brain data, for evaluating whatever the language for that particular device is, and my license doesn't allow me to do those types of things, the question becomes, even though I'm licensed, am I allowed to purchase said device? Most of the manufacturers of equipments do or may check for licensing from individuals if they're selling a 510K registered device, but for biofeedback devices, not necessary. So anyway, the point is it's also very unclear sometimes if those individuals are even checking or if they're just taking your money on an online order and shipping it off. But you should be asked to provide some evidence of a license if it has a 510K.
Yeah, and I want to add a little bit more to that one too. And
Mm-hmm.
this is an actual, these are, as far as I understand, actual facts. There are currently at least two manufacturers of neurofeedback equipment that are really pushing to get their equipment FDA approved, not just registered, but approved for treating medical disorders. And that's how they promote the sales of their equipment. And so what happened in this one case, I have a woman that contacted me and wanted some mentoring, and she got one of these pieces of equipment. And when it came to, she understood, using a cap for neurofeedback. And I said, okay, so now have you understood how to place electrodes? She goes, what's an electrode? I said, what equipment do you have and who trained you? So long story short is this company that's moving more towards getting this stuff approved medically, okay, just sells her a cap and says you can train using a cap as well. You don't need to have electrodes. Well, folks, for somebody new into our field, I think that's a really bad idea. I think you need to learn traditional methods and basic methods before you start going into doing full cap training with people. And she was saying it's a pain in the butt. This is really difficult. I can't imagine my patients running this thing on their head for 30 minutes.
Right.
So I told her about electrodes, but as another example of how the vendors, as you're saying, will push their equipment without necessarily checking what your background is, what your intent is. They're just trying to push their own product.
Yeah, exactly. This is a really tricky area, and it's not well defined. Like we can talk, theoretically for a long time about what we should and shouldn't do, but
Yeah.
this one's messy for all the people involved.
Yeah, exactly. All right.
So
Supervision. Go ahead.
well, I was just going to say, like, this is a really critical piece, particularly for those who might be either unlicensed or are working with symptoms or diagnoses that might be outside of our scope. So like with this, again, not to beat up on the seizure disorder example, but that's an excellent example of here's a situation where me having that letter from a physician saying, hey, please do this with my patient. In Arizona, because of the way that that situation was, that was an okay thing, but in another circumstance, it may not be. So like supervision is a legal definition, and sometimes you can do things under the supervision of another practitioner, but we need to understand what that supervision means. Like that is a legal, that means that the supervisor is legally responsible. So those people who have licenses, you know, this was like when you were doing your training and you weren't yet independently licensed, or maybe you were a student and your supervisor, excuse me, was legally responsible for your actions as well as the outcomes of the patient. So this happens not specific to neurofeedback, but to all sorts of things. So we want to make sure and pay really close attention to what does supervision mean versus mentoring. And mentoring might be something like you mentioned, giving Rusty Turner as an example, or buying a consultation from a neurologist and saying, okay, I need to get smarter about my presentation of my client. That would be mentoring, where there is no legal responsibility, so that person who is helping you or advising you is not taking on any legal responsibility. So that's, to my earlier point, that nuance about does it protect me or does it not protect me? It depends on a lot of the other variables there.
Exactly. And every state is, again, going to be different in terms of what their supervision requirements are, and states change over time. When I first came to North Carolina and applied for a license here, because I was licensed back in Oregon, the number of clinical hours you needed for supervision was 2,000. Well, I was able to demonstrate that and so forth. But since I got licensed here, they now pushed it up to 3,000 hours or whatever it was of clinical supervision. So states change. You got to really be on top of what Leslie's saying in terms of what your state is, how they regulate it, and that mentoring is not the same as supervision. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. So and there's been a couple of cases. This is why this note is on here, where thinking either you're the supervisor or the supervisee, but there are lots of requirements around how that takes place. And one that has happened and caused an ethical issue in our profession is individuals who are being supervised. And in that particular situation, I can't remember exactly the details, but the point is there were individuals who were unlicensed, if I recall correctly, working as technicians, but a practitioner had a clinic in multiple states, and that provider was licensed in multiple states. But while in state A, the technicians were working in state B, treating the clients. So, and it was a mental health kinds of situation. So it wasn't medical diagnoses, but mental health. And that was now illegal because the state B required that the supervisor be on site or available to them in state while they were delivering services. So we have to think about not only am I adequately done, but are people sitting in the right place? And it seems a little silly, but this ended up causing those individuals quite a bit of legal challenge, and I think ultimately they went away. So be sure to make sure that if you're being supervised or you're supervising, that you have all the legal things in place. Do I need to be on site? How often do I need to be on site? How available do I need to be or not? And where do I need to be located?
Yeah, this is one of the big ones that Judy keeps on harping on Leslie and I to keep on talking about, that specific topic during our trainings. And again, sort of an example of that would be if you're a clinician and you're getting busy in your practice, let's say you're BCIA certified, right? If you decide to have a technician trained and you can get a technician rating through BCIA, then you still have that responsibility for the supervision of the neurofeedback aspect. And in BCIA's guidelines, if I'm not mistaken, Leslie, you have to be present on site of where the technician is working. You can't have a clinic in New Jersey and you're working in New York. And so the clinic in New Jersey, you have a technician who's overseeing people and you're not in that office all the time. That I think is also not in the guidelines for BCIA. You need to be on site with your technicians.
Right, and that would be a mentor instead of a supervisor.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. This would be a mentor. Yeah, instead of a supervisor exactly. Who's overseeing your work.
Right. Yeah. So that's problematic. And then obviously, as noted here, excuse me, providing supervision outside of your profession can be problematic or challenging. It kind of depends, and your state will dictate that. So for example, in Arizona, a counselor can be supervised by other counselors, and they can be supervised for some hours by a psychologist. But if we're thinking about working in the practice of, then physicians also can supervise. So for many years, as an example, I worked for a physician in a clinic that was supervised by a physician. So when the physician was on site and I was delivering neurofeedback services to patients of that physician, I was what's called a physician extension. So that was the legal authority of that person to have another individual carry out their orders in technical processes. So it's equivalent to having nurses or having other types of technician level individuals, labs, and those kinds of things happening under their supervision, direct supervision, and that's an important distinction. Sometimes there'll be supervision and sometimes there'll be direct supervision. Direct supervision means I'm literally, the supervisor is on site and capable of intervening at any moment with that patient or that supervisee. So you have to figure that out within your state. So it might be problematic, it might be okay. It just kind of depends on, can you be the supervisor of someone else and who might be in a different, and it can be usually the mental health kinds of clusters, at least in Arizona, things that are clustered together, marriage, family therapy, social work, and counseling are kind of clustered together. So those have pretty decent crossover, but psychology and is a different board. So you have to pay attention to the nuances within your state.
Yeah, nothing to really add there. Okay, good.
So we've hit on this a lot, and so I don't know that we need to like really go through, and this has kind of been a theme, a big theme, but ultimately I think there is this this quote that you provided from Mark Trollinger, which is basically, if you can't diagnose it, you can't treat it, and that holds true. So who is the person who is capable of diagnosing it, and then who is the person who's capable of treating it? The one exception to that, and I don't know how this would fit for neurofeedback within those states, I'm not in those states, but there are some states where again, we use counseling as an example. A licensed professional counselor is unable to diagnose. They have to send their patient to another provider, a psychiatrist or a physician or somebody else, to get a diagnosis and provide a recommendation for treatment. And then the counselor can actually do their counseling work with that person. So there is a bit of an exception, but at least if you can't diagnose it, you for sure can't treat it in most states and in most professions.
Yeah, and what I want to add here, since this was, from Mark, and for those that aren't familiar, Mark is working with ISNR. He's on our CPT committee. He's the one that goes to the AMA meetings to push forward getting separate CPT codes for neurofeedback. And our goal with ISNR was to have that ready this year. The pandemic set us back a couple of years, so we're hoping we may have more information about billing insurances through legitimate means within the next year or so. But an example of that is I worked in a clinic as well. I worked in a doctor's office. So I agree with everything you're saying about working under a doctor's office. They're there, they're present. You can work with their patients and you're usually covered pretty well. But I worked in a clinic and they enrolled me in various insurance companies. And one day the insurance company wanted me to go over a particular case, and they were using a certain billing code, and the insurance company asked about neurofeedback and said, well, that's a biofeedback method, and they wanted to decrease the amount covered because biofeedback coverage under insurance is much less than what you would get with the codes we use for psychotherapy plus intervention, the current codes being used by most in this profession. And I had to get on the phone with this insurance people, and they started asking me about diagnosis and treatment. And I got through it with the help of the director. And then I turned to her and I said, I will no longer work with any patients that you're billing because they're asking me questions about a medical diagnosis. And so you got to be really, really careful with all this stuff in terms of your insurance people when you're filing. If they come back and at any point in time, an insurance company wants to, they can come into your practice and look at your records. So you got to make sure you've got your I's dotted and your T's crossed to cover yourself with all this information we're giving you.
Yeah, and
Good.
not only are there the legal and financial implications of that, but then if they find things, they'll report it to the licensing board. So
Yep.
it can get pretty hairy pretty quickly. Yeah.
And they will take
Yeah.
back all the money they paid you too.
Yes. And then you're in front of your licensing board trying to defend yourself, which is unfun. Yeah, so I think I'm mindful of the time, and I think maybe that we'll talk about these pieces real quick, and then you can have
Go into
we
some
can have some
Q&A. Yeah.
questions, Q&A. But because this kind of is a great segue into that piece and kind of a nice point to conclude, and then pick up on some specific concerns and examples in a future get together.
Yeah.
But thinking about dual relationships, this has come up several times. There was obviously one really well publicized example that happened, I guess maybe in the past 5 years. I can't remember. Now that we're old, time goes at a different scale. But it was around 5-ish years ago. But there's the dual relationship is particularly problematic, obviously, with family and those kinds of things. We shouldn't have be supervising or supervised by. And that's in the legal sense of the word. Obviously, if you're in a group practice and you're working with your family or your colleague, your spouse, or whatever is your colleague, then that's a different kind of a scenario. We're not talking about, one person managing the front desk and another being the provider, or even being two individual providers. But in a legal supervision kind of a way, this would be a very problematic situation. Would violate all of our 50 states practice, the scope of practice and supervision requirements. But having dual relationships in rural areas is a little bit more, meaning there is more latitude, but it still wouldn't allow it. So the supervision piece is still very strict. That would be inappropriate to be doing that unless both individuals were independently licensed. So if my father were a physician and I were a licensed counselor, then there could be a referral back and forth, but still that supervision, if it were a legal thing, let's say he was a neurologist and my father is not, but let's pretend for a moment he was a neurologist, and he said, I want you to do, work with my patient who has a seizure disorder. That would not be an appropriate thing, because now there is a family relationship. Even though we're both capable, competent, and independently licensed, he could not be the supervisor of me. So dual relationships are always a sticky thing. They're not always unethical. It's not always illegal or unethical to be involved in a dual relationship. But generally speaking, and specifically as it relates to supervision and scope of practice, it's probably best to avoid dual relationships.
Agreed. All right. Well, let's go ahead, Richard. It'll take a minute to get people unmuted, and then we'll go into some Q&A. And then Leslie and I will get together and look at another date, and we'll do part 2 here for the New Mind group with this. So, Richard, let us know when people are unmuted.
Rob, I got a quick question.
Yeah, great. Hey, Vic.
Hi, Leslie. I'm curious about your quote of Mark
Trulinger.
Yeah, because you see, I'm a nurse practitioner, and depending on how old you are, if you were trained before a certain year, like 1980, you were never allowed to diagnose. Nurses had their own taxonomy for, it was called NAMD or something, whereby they would talk about clusters of symptoms and syndromes. But later on, certainly probably after 2000, as far as I understand, the DSM can be used by anybody who has sort of training to know how to apply the criteria. Not anybody, I'm exaggerating, but in my profession, it's probably a master's degree that's required for a nurse to be able to diagnose, rather than the old school nurses who taught me, who were ready to wrap me over the knuckles if I used the diagnosis that wasn't, a nursing diagnosis. So you know what I'm trying to say? This question of
yeah.
okay.
And that's it's part of the state, and you're exactly right. Nurse practitioners are a kind of evolving and a different field, really, and it's particularly the way that it has evolved. Two nurse practitioners work in my office, so I'm quite familiar with how that piece goes, at least here in Arizona. And your state licensing would determine. So, like for example, there are many diagnoses, and including DSM diagnoses, that at least here in Arizona, those nurse practitioners are allowed to diagnose and prescribe for and to treat. But there are still even some diagnoses that they still require a physician to provide. And there's some dynamic that where there is a physician, at least here in Arizona, a physician who is some technical relationship with the nurse practitioner. So I think that you point out a good thing, that is basically, that is a kind of a generic statement. As I even mentioned, there are some states where even mental health care providers are unable to diagnose a particular disorder, but are able to treat it once that diagnosis is received from someone else. So there's nuances within the states, and that's ultimately what you're getting at. So I assume in your state, obviously, you have the capacity to provide diagnoses as a nurse practitioner and then provide treatment for those.
Yeah, I guess yes and no. Lately, you see certainly with the example you used with epilepsy is one thing, but let me give you an example. I'm not highly qualified in neurology, but I use catatonia on a spectrum just the same as many other providers who know anything about EEG who talk about epilepsy on the spectrum. And now that we're moving into the transdiagnostic model, everything is in shades of gray. So it does become harder to know which ones may be excluded out of our scope of practice. You know what I'm trying to say? And I don't mean to say everything's gray, but we seem to be moving into more gray areas.
You're exactly right.
Professionally, right?
Yeah, we would agree.
So
you have to be extra cautious.
Thank you. Right.
I think leading and the way to mitigate that risk would be creating a paper trail of here's how my practice act is defined, and these are the types of things, and now here are the symptom cluster of the presentation that fits within my scope, and here's what I'm doing. I think having that as part of the treatment plan, or like a general chart note or some documentation of that rationale, that would be the protection that I obviously we couldn't do that just for anything willy-nilly, but that's how I would protect myself, is leading a very clear,
thank you,
a contemporaneous trail. Yeah, excellent example. And you're right, it's very gray and becoming more gray.
Anyone else?
This is Jerome speaking from Alpha Mind.
For something like ADD, ADHD, I mean, that's where it gets real gray. We have so many patients that want the cure-all for the ADHD, but are we only able to treat the symptoms around the ADD, and not focus on, like that are really attention? I mean, is that a symptom, or is that a treatment for the ADD?
I missed a couple of the words, but basically what I think, and correct me if I misunderstood the question at all, is like, because the disorder is complex, are we treating only the symptom presentation or treating the actual etiology of the disorder? Is that the question?
That is correct. I mean, that is absolutely
correct. Okay, good.
People come to us and they want the cure-all for ADD. I mean, if we're adjusting theta waves up in the frontal cortex, is that the cure-all? But that's getting into medical, right?
Not necessarily. I think it depends on, like, a ADHD diagnosis is one in the behavioral mental health world, certainly in the medical community, can diagnose that, but as can behavioral health and even some other peripheral kinds of things, nurse practitioners or whatever, depending on states. So I think, like there's two questions that are kind of embedded in there. One of them is who can do that and how do we talk about it? And then the second question is more of a basic science theoretical thing of what are we actually doing? And I think to the latter question of what are we actually doing, the answer would be yes. At least with ADHD, treating many of the symptoms is aimed at treating the underlying physiological underpinning of what's causing it. So like in your example of training frontal theta, I think that is getting at the actual disorder as well as regulating symptom. But to the more complicated piece, perhaps, of the who can do it kind of thing, or what are we talking about? If I am a provider of neurofeedback and diagnosing and treating ADHD is within scope of practice, then it's a matter of semantics. Like either way, we're hopefully helping that individual by regulating their theta waves in this example, and then minimizing symptoms and reducing the presence of a diagnosis. If I am unable to diagnose and treat because of my scope of practice or my I'm not being licensed or my licensure limitations, then I would be actually aimed at symptom management, right? So that's, again, it's a distinction without a difference in many ways, because now I'm aiming at increasing or improving attention, aimed at increasing concentration, all those kinds of things that are not diagnostic or like categories. But it kind of opens up even another area of like, if a person shows up and we know clearly they have a diagnosis, and we say, I'm just helping improve attention, but they have a known disorder of attention, then aren't we treating the disorder? So again, we have to be able to carefully piece these things apart in the semantics of it. But,
yeah. So using the word treatment becomes more of a problem if you're treating versus we're doing some training. And the other thing here, Leslie, a lot of us here at New Mind Group consider ADHD to be basically a diagnosis that doesn't really exist. We really think that in many cases, these are kids with severe anxiety and sleep disorders, which creates the attentional problem. So in response to your comment, so if you're saying I can't treat ADHD, but you're saying, but I can treat anxiety and people with fatigue and not sleeping well, then you're within your scope doing the same thing. If that helps.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, a lot of kids have restless leg tics, okay, as a result of the ADHD, so I cannot say I'm treating the tics, which we do, we do SMR, and stuff, and with the right, we've had tremendous success with that, but that's crossing the line. We're treating a physical condition, not a mental condition.
Right.
Okay, so back to semantics.
It's back to
exactly.
Exactly. Right. Well, and I think again, to the earlier point, it's like contemporaneously documenting what your decision process is and what you are doing and why you believe that to be what you're doing goes a long, long way. Yeah.
Well, we're sort of at the top of the hour here, folks. So Leslie and I will get together. We'll get up a date and we'll come back and do part 2 of this. And if you have other questions you want us to answer, if you'd like to send those to us, either one of us, we'll put that in our queue for the next time we come back to finish up the rest of this talk. So for now, hey, thanks, Leslie. That was fun.
Thank you. Yeah,
and,
always is.
And I'll get with you and everybody else. Remember, I think we have something happening this Friday. We have a guest talk. So we'll see you on Friday.
Thank you very much, both of you. Very
Thank you.
useful info.